Hello everybody, welcome back to Anglo Election Insights, where today I'm going to be doing a September sweep looking through all the latest polling from the Anglosphere. And the theme is that for the incumbent governments, the honeymoons are either over, long over, or still going in the case of Anthony Albanese. So let's jump right in. Starting with Australian federal polls. So here we've got the 2025 election and 4 recent polls from 4 different firms. Now, there are more polls, which you can go and read, of course, but these I felt were the 4 most relevant for today's video. Now, just note that I've rounded up to the nearest whole number for primary votes, so just keep that one in mind. Now, so firstly, we can see at the 2025 election, Labor's vote at 35%, the Coalition 32, Greens 12, and then Pauline Hanson's One Nation at 6, which resulted in the ALP winning by just over 5% on two-party preferred. It's a pretty emphatic result, and we'll see that trend is continuing in some of these polls. The big takeaway here, I would say, is the coalition primary, which has actually dropped from a historic low point at 32%. The Greens just bouncing around, Labor also just in and around where they were at I won't say historic high, a recent high, but this is actually quite low for them over the course of their history as a party. But, in terms of two-party preferred measure, looking very healthy across the board here. Perhaps the most striking feature, though, is One Nation's vote, which is approaching that of the Greens, and in fact even higher in this Resolve Strategic poll. So it seems that most of the movement in the polls since the election, at least in this month, has been coalition voters defecting over to One Nation. And most of the preferences are intact, it would appear. And in fact, you can even see in Redbridge that the ALP's two-party preferred lead has come in a little bit. So interesting there. I'll just move on to Australian states. This channel is an Anglosphere channel, but it does obviously have a bit of a focus on Australia. So we can see not every firm regularly releases polls for every state, and some of these polls won't be from the month of September. Just keep that in mind too. But I've included as many as I thought were relevant to today's video. So we can see here in Victoria, to Labor state, they're leading in all 3 of the latest polls. Not by a whole heap, and their primary vote is certainly down on where it has been in the past, but the coalition really struggling to flip voters from Labor to the coalition. A lot of Labor's lost voters just spraying around everywhere, and a fair bit of it is coming back as preferences. But all of these polls are indicating at least a sort of 3-ish% swing towards the coalition still. We go to New South Wales. I spoke briefly in the Kiama video about that Resolve poll, which puts Labor's lead at nearly 10% based on preference estimates. We also have this Demos-AU poll from, I think this is actually going back a few months, which was about 54%. So that would be a status quo result. The reality is probably somewhere in between those polls at the current moment. Over in Queensland, and I've failed to colour in a box here, whoops. But we have 2 polls from Redbridge and Demos-AU showing the LNP government travelling pretty smoothly. I think they're from a few months ago. The most recent one was from Resolve, which actually had the ALP leading slightly on preference estimates. And that was a bit of a shock poll, but it did come amongst a run of Resolve strategic polls that showed massive leads to Labor federally, in New South Wales, etc. So just be careful of that one. But the ALP brand obviously travelling very strong throughout all of the states, basically, in terms of the Resolve series. Over in South Australia, these are 2 old polls. Demos-AU at 59%, two-party preferred to the ALP. I think that was during the federal campaign period. And then obviously there was that huge YouGov result, 67% two-party preferred for the ALP. Again, the reality is probably somewhere between that. And then finally in Tasmania, we have had a post-election poll from EMRS, which showed the primary votes for the Liberals and Labor pretty much unchanged. But they obviously, under Hare Clark, two-party preferred isn't really a thing. Cool. So let's keep moving. Canada federal polls. So obviously Mark Carney won with the Liberals in 2025, just prior to the Australian election, about a 3% or 2.5% lead. Again, I've just gone up to the round number. The general trend here is that the Liberal vote is mostly down off these highs. The Conservative vote, depending on which poll, is sort of holding up in and around where they were, and both the Bloc, Québécois, and the NDP increasing their vote share. But overall, most polls are showing a Liberal lead. But, and I'll just jump out of the slides to go into a little bit more detail here. A lot of these polls since the election, particularly from firms such as Nanos, Ledger, these kinds of pollsters, they've been showing pretty big Liberal leads, like double-digit Liberal leads, with the Conservative vote back down in the low 30s. But as you move up a little bit, a big tightening in Nanos, Abacus data, moving from sort of small Liberal leads, even showing the Conservatives in front a few weeks ago. Main Street, similar sort of movement. Angus Reid, another pollster that found the Conservatives in front. And yeah, you can see that the NDP gaining a lot. Whether that's to do with Air Canada, maybe it's just some of their natural support coming back. I think the general feeling is that perhaps domestic issues are starting to come back into the national conversation, and Trump is not so much in the national conversation. That might be working against Mark Carney a little bit. But still, in most polls, the Liberals holding a narrow lead. Cool, so I'll jump back into the slides here. So here we have New Zealand, which I haven't covered New Zealand polling for a little while, but we've got the 2023 result with Nationals well in front of Labor, and ACT, the slightly dominant partner over New Zealand First here, who had a late surge to clear the 5% threshold. And then the Greens holding fairly steady, 12%, and Te Pāti Māori rounding out the left bloc. Their strength lies in winning the Māori electorates, so they don't need to clear the threshold because they tend to win the Māori-only electorates. Now, the general trend here has been the national vote is well down, edging back towards the early 30s, and the Labor vote has been trending up towards the early mid-30s. And in most polls now, Labor has a lead over the Nationals, a slim one, but a lead nonetheless, and it is growing. New Zealand First appears to be polling a little bit better, and now they are actually outpolling ACT in some of these polls. The Greens holding fairly steady, and Te Pāti Māori also holding reasonably steady. But we can see here, if you look at the blocks, as in the left and right blocks, the left block now has a lead in the majority of these polls, except for the One News poll, which I think is the oldest of these polls anyway. So very interesting to see the movement there. And once again, I'll jump out of the slides and we'll have a look. You can see over time, the national lead was holding up. There was a brief period sort of earlier in the year where Labor won a few polls, National then back out in front, but it seems that voters are increasingly sick of this government. The solutions and the change that they promised to people's living standards not really playing out the way voters had hoped. So definitely a lot of pressure on the nationals at this point, or national, I should say. I think in my original New Zealand video, my inclination is to call them the Nationals, but in New Zealand they're just called National, or the National Party. And in fact, even I was chatting to a New Zealand colleague of mine, and he was saying they don't even really say the Greens, they say the Green Party. So I must make sure that I adjust my language a little bit. Because I mean, sort of funny how like in Australia we wouldn't say the Labours, but we do say the Greens or the Liberals or the Nationals. But in New Zealand it's all Labor, National, Green, Act. Yeah, interesting. Anyway, we might move on to the UK. So here, I'll start in on this slide where obviously there's been a massive change since the 2024 election. Labour with again, rounding up to the whole number, but Labour with a commanding lead over the Tories. But in all of these polls since, we can see here I've got a few different pollsters mentioned. Labour struggling to stay above 20. The Tories seem to have bottomed out in the late teens. Their vote share hasn't sort of cratered anymore. Reform, their vote share has doubled and then some, basically. Most pollsters have them in the early 30s now. Some outlier polls have even put it more in the mid-30s. Find Out Now, for example, is a pollster that seems to be quite friendly towards reform. The Lib Dems, mostly up from the 2024 election result, although I think with the Lib Dems, their strength lies in local campaigning. So even if their overall vote share might be somewhat volatile in some of these polls, as we'll see when we go to some of the council by-elections, when they run hard, they tend to do quite well. And the Greens polling mostly a little bit above their 2024 election result. That could be impacted going forward by the whole Your Party thing with Jeremy Corbyn, but then they seem to have collapsed into infighting at this point. So the Greens might be able to reassert their dominance over that sort of socialist left voter bloc. And as we can see here, all the polls with a big lead to reform. And if we just come back here to the Wikipedia aggregate, you can see you have to scroll a long way before you can find a poll that reform didn't lead or share the lead in. Here we go. Finally, we've got one from late April, which was a tie, but we have to go all the way back to mid-April before we find Labour leading a poll over reform there. And keep in mind that the local elections on May 1, as well as the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, at this point, reform had a few big polls, but they were still polling in and around the late 20s. So if anything, their position has strengthened since then, and that was a pretty remarkable result. Here we've got the local council by-elections. So this is since the last set of local elections at the beginning of May this year. You can see there's a vote aggregate, and as I mentioned, the Lib Dems doing quite well, who are noted for local campaigning, but Labour well down, the Tories well down, sort of everyone more or less down except for the Lib Dems and obviously Reform, surging up to 27.5% there. Cool. So lastly, I want to cover the US. I'm not even going to bother to go back to the slides. We're just going to jump on RCP. Now, the three main measures to track as far as the national environment goes are Trump's sort of favourable and unfavourable or approval. At the moment, unfavourable clearly ahead at just under 52%. There were periods over, for example, Biden's presidency where that was well into double figures. So, and Trump's approval back in his first term was actually worse throughout a lot of the terms. So it's not a terrible number, but obviously not an encouraging number for MAGA. The Republican Party, they're also about 13% underwater, but the striking one here is the Democrat Party, still polling at almost 30% unfavourable, which to me, that suggests that turnout could be a big factor in 2026. Obviously, in 2022, the Democrats were kind of on the nose. Joe Biden's approval was falling, and the Republicans had sort of the political winds behind them, and they were expecting quite a big result. But ultimately, turnout dynamics ensured that the Democrats hung on to most of their Senate seats, at least. Whereas, if the Democrat Party itself is polling this badly in terms of favorability, I wonder if everyone is going to turn out and vote for them to keep Republicans out, or even to flip some of these key Senate seats, that sort of thing, that they'll be aiming for in 2026. So I'll be keeping a close eye on that one. Also, you have the generic congressional vote. That's obviously going to be a big deal in 2026. We can see all this like redistricting wars and that sort of thing already beginning and playing out. What's interesting is that one of the best pollsters of the last few presidential cycles, Atlas Intel, is they've got the Democrats out to high single-digit leads, like more like 8-9%, including with the Democrat vote above 50%. So that's a key sign that maybe things are not going very well for the Republicans at this stage. But I just want to dive into, we can see that here, Atlas Intel, their last poll at +8 for the Democrats. I want to dive into a couple of these races that are coming up in this November, a couple of gubernatorial races. So firstly, you have Virginia governor. The current incumbent is, of course, a Republican, Glenn Youngkin, whose win was a bit of a surprise back in 2021. Here, Spanberger appears to be well and truly in the lead. Has cracked 50% in a couple of these polls and is very close in a couple of others. To me, that's a show of decent strength. There is some early vote data that suggests that big Trump counties are turning up in greater numbers than some of the big Harris counties from 2024, but I still think Spanberger is well and truly in the lead there. Perhaps the more interesting race this time will be the New Jersey race between Citarelli and Sherrill. They just had a debate where Citarelli was thought to have performed a little bit better, depending on who you ask. In the published polling, he's well behind, nearly 9 points behind, but there have been a couple of Republican internals, including this one released just yesterday, I think, which actually showed Citarelli up by 1%, leading 46 to 45. Obviously, that's an internal. They leak those strategically. So, no surprise that perhaps there's a bit of incongruity between a Republican internal and the public polls. But last time in 2021, the public polling showed the race to be quite one-sided, and in the end, these Republican internals turned out to be much more accurate. Interesting to keep in mind. Finally, we have the New York City mayor race. So Mandani obviously won the Democrat primary, and now it looks like a 4-horse race at the moment. I think I saw on a matchup between Mandani and Cuomo with no one else in the race. It's quite close, but with the non-Mandani vote being split across 3 candidates, he has a commanding lead for the moment. And I'm not sure either Sluer or Eric Adams are intending to drop out of this race, but I suppose it is possible. All right, I think that'll do us. So thanks for watching, guys. Again, I'll have another video out more focused on the Liberal Party and how they might be able to put their voting coalition back together. That'll be out later this week. But I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you enjoyed having a polling roundup across the Anglosphere, and let me know in the comments if you think it's something that I should definitely continue. Thanks again. I'll see you guys in the next video.